Good morning, class, and welcome to week 5 of our semester. It's so hard to believe that we are now in the second half of the semester. It really does go by quick. So hope you enjoyed our previous discussion about performance reviews and evaluation and all that. Going to switch gears this week and start talking about compensation. So, which is one of my favorite topics as well. Here at Oklahoma State, I actually teach a class in person in the business school all about compensation. So again, it's something that's incredibly important to HR as well as for any manager whatsoever. And I think part of the reason why compensation is so fascinating is no matter if you end up in HR or even if you're just a manager in another field, compensation is absolutely 100% relevant to anything you do. I mean, we all work for pretty much the same reason, and that's to get paid. So compensation in this chapter and then in the next chapter that we also discuss, we'll kind of talk about all those details about what it means to how do we determine how much to pay somebody? What does a market tell us? What do we pay a number that keeps us competitive but also gives us money to use our company finances in other areas. So compensation to me is an incredibly fascinating topic. So here in chapter 11, a couple main things that I definitely want to draw your attention to. First is there's some discussions about things called pay levels and job structures, and that kind of relate to external equity or internal equity. So with pay levels, that's kind of how we determine, what levels that we pay. What do we pay a vice president? What do we pay a director? What do we pay a frontline employee? Well, to get a lot of that information, we do a lot of market surveys, and your book does a good job of discussing what type of surveys we do, how we do them, how we collect the data, and then how do we utilize that data. So once we know what our competitors are paying and kind of what the general market tells us, it makes it easier for us to determine the correct pay. For example, Coke and Pepsi, two of the biggest competitors in the U.S., it's incredibly important for them to know what their competitors are paying. So if a manager in marketing, for example, is making $100,000 at Pepsi, well, Coke wants to get that person over. They may offer them $125,000 so that they're incentivizing that person to want to come over. So that's a great example of what a market survey can tell you. At the same time, some companies kind of take the opposite effect. They may actually end up paying less money for a position, knowing that maybe they can still get a quality person, and they can take those savings and put them in the marketing budget or put them in the finance budget or whatever. So it's incredibly important to kind of keep a good balance. Your book also does a good job of talking about, job structuring and job evaluation, which you may have heard in maybe your intro and some other classes as well. We use this to determine internal equity. So how are we paying, employees relative to each other? Where you see this a lot of times is, let's say you have an accountant making $45,000 a year. Well, let's say you have a new position open and you want to bring another accountant on board. Well, maybe the market is such that you have to pay that person $50,000 or $55,000 just to get them to join the firm. Well, once they come on board, that person who's been working at your company for a couple of years, making less money, are they going to perceive that as fair? Are they going to feel like you're treating them differently? And then some equal opportunity issues can start coming in. Where potentially you may be paying men different than women, or maybe paying older workers different than younger workers. So it's something that companies and compensation professionals spend a lot of time focusing on, is internal equity and things like that. So, and again, your book does a good job of describing what equity is. And I definitely want to make a distinction that we're talking differences between equity and equality. Equality is basically just that. Everything is equal. So you, for example, would pay every person who comes into your organization who's an accountant $45,000 a year. That's equality. No matter what your background, no matter who you are, you're going to get paid the same, $45,000. That's equality. And while equality is very important, most companies don't follow that process. They do equity instead of equality. So equity means based on your job experience, based on your education. Do you have a master's degree? Do you have a doctoral degree? Have you worked in big organizations or have you worked in small organizations? So they take all those factors and then they try to determine what is the fairest way to pay you. That's equity when you kind of look at it as a broad whole. And again, it's still very fair and legal because again, you're paying people more that have more experience, have more education. And as long as you're consistent with that, then usually you don't have a problem. The other two bigger issues that I want to definitely draw your attention to is your book talks about job bands and job banding. Job grades themselves. The book talks about grades. This is kind of how you determine. You've probably all seen something like, a job, will be in grade 1. So at the very minimum, it pays $10 an hour. At the midpoint, it pays $15 an hour. And then at the high end, it pays $20 an hour. And then based on your education level, based on your years of experience, you kind of fall into where that is. And most companies, for the most part, try to bring people in somewhere between the 25th percentile and the midpoint, so that it's kind of a good starting point to give you an ability to grow throughout your career. Because if you bring somebody in at the very max of the position, yeah, you could bring them in at $20 an hour and they're going to be really happy with that. But where's the job growth? If you're at the very max of the grade, you can't really grow from there. So job grades are used in those areas. Another common form of compensation structure is job banding, which basically just kind of says it's a similar structure, but basically we're just going to make these big, long job grades. So, for example, you can pay someone between $25,000 and $50,000, and you just kind of figure out where you want to put them. So, again, these are probably the two most common forms of how companies set up their compensation structures. So make sure you pay close attention to those details. Again, this is one of my favorite topics because, again, I teach this class here at Oklahoma State, but also because no matter what field you go into, you're going to utilize compensation skills, and the ability to understand this is going to only make you a better manager. And just kind of a side note as well, compensation is probably the fastest growing aspect within human resources nationwide. There's not a very big shortage of recruiters or, people like that, but in the HR world, there is a strong need and a big shortage of compensation professionals. So if it's a field you're really interested in and you go into, I can assure you it can be both very lucrative, and you can, there's a lot of opportunity to grow here because, again, there's not a whole lot of people that do this type of work. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll see you here in a few minutes.